In the second week of February in the year 1869, a party of 5 men working a hard logging contract in the northern hill country made camp at the end of a long day of felling timber in a bitter cold, and only 2 of them woke up the next morning. The other 3 were found in their bedrolls, wrapped in good wool blankets, laid close to a fire pit that still held unburned wood stacked and ready, in a shelter that had kept the wind off them well enough all night. There had been no blizzard that night, no storm at all, only an ordinary hard cold, the kind those men had slept through a dozen times before without any trouble whatsoever. And yet 3 grown, strong, experienced men who had cut timber in that country for years and knew cold as well as any man alive, froze to death in their own bedrolls with a full woodpile sitting 8 feet away and 2 living men sleeping in the same shelter. The storm got blamed because a hard cold snap always gets blamed, the same way the wolf gets blamed and the cold itself gets blamed for 100 frontier deaths it never caused alone. But there was no storm that night, friend, and the 2 men who woke up in the morning were sleeping in the exact same cold, under the exact same sky, in the exact same shelter as the 3 men who did not. Something else killed those 3 men, and it had almost nothing to do with how cold that night actually was, and everything to do with one plain, ordinary choice those 3 men made, without a second thought, hours before they ever laid down. The temperature gets blamed for more frontier deaths than it ever earned on its own, because a number on a thermometer or the memory of a hard number makes for an easy villain, cold and simple and impossible to argue with. But cold alone very rarely kills a man who has a fire, a shelter, and a good wool blanket, which is exactly what those 5 men had. What killed 3 of them and spared 2 in the same shelter under the same sky was something those men were wearing against their own skin when they climbed into their blankets, something so ordinary, so unremarkable, so much a fixture of daily frontier life that not one of them thought twice about it. And it is the exact same thing that still puts campers, hikers, hunters, and stranded travelers into the ground today in weather that by rights should never have been able to kill them. That is the myth I am pulling apart for you tonight, the myth that a good blanket and a nearby fire are enough to see a man through a cold night, because that myth, trusted by capable men for longer than this country has existed, has frozen more frontier folks in their own bedding than every blizzard combined, and it is doing the same thing to people today, in tents and trucks and deer stands, for the exact same reason it took 3 of those 5 loggers in 1869. Here's the twist, and I want you sitting with it a moment before we go any further, because it is the whole spine of what I am handing you tonight. The blanket was not the failure. The fire was not the failure. Those men did the hard, sensible, careful work of building a shelter and keeping wood on hand, and every bit of that work was sound. What failed them was underneath all of it, pressed right up against their own skin, something they had sweated into all day long without a thought and carried straight into their bedrolls that night. And that one plain choice undid every bit of the good work they had done around it. What those men were trying to do has a name older than any of us. It is called surviving a cold night on the strength of what you sleep in, not merely what you sleep under. And your great-great-grandfather understood that difference in his bones, the same way he understood 100 other small, unglamorous rules that kept him breathing through winters, that killed careless men all around him. I am going to walk you through every piece of that rule tonight, plain and complete, so you would know it cold if you ever needed it. Every piece except the one that took those 3 loggers, and I am handing you that piece last, because it is the piece that matters most of all. If you found yourself stranded tonight, out past dark and real cold, with nothing but the clothes on your back, a blanket, and a fire, most folks in this country would trust exactly what those 3 men trusted, and for the exact same reason. They would figure a fire and a good thick blanket were the whole answer, and they would climb into that blanket wearing whatever they happened to be wearing all day, sweat-damp work clothes and all, and some of them would wake up stiff and cold and lucky, and some of them, on a bad enough night, would not wake up at all, and the people who found them would blame the cold, the same way the people who found those 3 loggers blamed a storm that was never even there. That is the knowing we are digging back up tonight, neighbor. Not simply how to build a shelter or keep a fire, what to have next to your own skin when the sun goes down, which turns out to be a different question entirely, and the answer to it is exactly what separated 2 living loggers from 3 dead ones on an ordinary cold night in 1869. We will get to every bit of it. Stay with me, because what I'm about to hand you might be worth more to you on a bad night than any coat you own. I am Ezra Calhoun, and I have spent my whole life on a stretch of Ozark ground. My family has worked for the better part of 200 years back in a hollow we still call Calhoun Hollow, tucked into the Missouri backcountry, where the hills fold up close and the winters bite harder than most folks expect out of the South. My grandfather Gideon raised me on that ground, and he was born in 1919 and lived to be 89 years old. And he spent a good part of his younger life working timber and running trap lines in weather that would put most modern men in the hospital inside a day. He knew this particular danger the hard way, the way most of the old-timers did, because he lost a cousin to it as a young man. Out on a trap line in weather no worse than a dozen nights he had slept through just fine, and it taught him a lesson he never once let me forget. What I know about this, I learned the same way I learned everything worth knowing from that man, standing next to him, watching him do it right year after year, and hearing him explain it plain whenever I got it wrong. This is not something I picked up out of a book. It is something that was drilled into my hands and my habits by a man who had buried people over exactly this mistake and had no patience left for anybody making it twice. By the time we are through here tonight, you will understand why the thing you wear closest to your own skin matters more in real cold than the thickest blanket or the biggest fire you could ever build. You will know the season and the situation that sets this trap without a single person ever noticing it closing, because it is not the coldest nights that catch the most people. It is the ones that only look mild. You will know the warning signs your own body gives you as this danger takes hold, signs that come on so gradual and so strange that the person in danger is very often the last one to understand what is happening to them. You will know what the old-timers actually wore and why, and the plain, unglamorous habit they practiced every single night that modern folks have almost entirely forgotten. And you will know the last piece, the piece that explains why this exact danger, ancient as the first cold night any man ever survived, became more common rather than less as this country grew richer and more comfortable, and it has everything to do with a single fabric that took over this country's closets for reasons that had nothing at all to do with keeping anybody warm. That is where we are headed tonight, piece by piece, and I am leaving nothing out. There are 6 pieces to understanding how a man freezes in his own bedding on a night that should never have killed him, and coming out the other side warm and breathing every single time. 6 in order, and the order matters because the shape of this danger only makes sense once you have walked it front to back. The first 2 pieces, most folks who have spent real time outdoors in the cold already carry some rough instinct about, even without being able to say exactly why. The middle pieces are where good, tough, experienced people still get caught, because this danger, like the others I have walked you through, does not announce itself the way a blizzard does. And the 6th piece, the last one, explains something that ought to trouble you a little, which is why this old frontier danger did not fade away. As this country got warmer coats, better fabrics, and easier lives, in some ways it got worse. That is the piece that will change how you think about the clothes hanging in your own closet before tonight is through. The first piece is understanding that cold by itself is rarely what actually kills a man in a survival situation. And this sounds like a strange thing to say about a danger everybody calls freezing to death, so let me lay it out plain. Your body is a furnace, and a remarkably good one. A healthy man doing ordinary work generates a steady stream of heat all on his own, hour after hour, and given dry insulation and shelter from wind, that heat is more than enough to keep him alive through cold that would seem on paper to be lethal. Men have slept out in temperatures well below freezing, dry and properly layered, and woken up perfectly fine because dry insulation traps the heat their own bodies were already making and holds it close, the same way a good root cellar holds the Earth's steady temperature regardless of the weather outside its walls. The danger was never simply the number on a thermometer. The danger is what happens when the insulation between a man's own furnace and the freezing world outside stops doing its job, and there is exactly one thing more than any other that ruins insulation faster and more completely than anything else in nature, and that thing is water. Water conducts heat away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than still air does. Sit that number with me a moment because it is the whole engine driving everything I am going to tell you tonight. 25 times. That means a man standing in 50-degree air, uncomfortable perhaps, but in no real danger, loses heat at a rate roughly comparable to a man standing in 50-degree water fighting for his life. If the water on his skin is doing the same job that the water in his fully submerged body would be doing. Wet clothing pressed against skin does not merely fail to insulate. It becomes a highway, pulling heat straight out of the body and flinging it into the cold air, and it does this constantly, relentlessly, hour after hour, whether the wearer is moving or lying perfectly still in a blanket. A dry blanket over wet clothing does not solve this problem. It merely slows down how fast the heat escapes the room, so to speak, while the water against the skin continues doing its relentless work underneath, drawing warmth out of the body every single minute of the night. Now, here is where the old-timers understood something that most folks today have entirely lost, and it comes down to one plain fact about two different fabrics, cotton and wool, and how each of them behaves the moment they get wet. Cotton, when it takes on moisture, whether from rain, snow, or a man's own sweat, loses the overwhelming majority of its insulating value almost immediately, and worse, it holds onto that moisture stubbornly, staying cold and wet against the skin for hours, sometimes for the entire length of a long winter night, doing that relentless heat-stealing work I just described the whole time. Wool behaves entirely differently. Wool fiber has a structure that continues to trap warm air and insulate even when it is significantly wet, nowhere near as well as dry wool, but meaningfully, measurably better than wet cotton, and wool also wicks moisture away from the skin and releases it gradually rather than holding it pooled and cold against the body. This single difference between two ordinary fabrics, one that most people today could not begin to explain, is very likely the entire difference between the two loggers who woke up and the three who did not on that ordinary February night in 1869. So the first piece is this, and it runs against the instinct of most modern folks who think about cold survival purely in terms of thickness and quantity, more blankets, a bigger coat, piling on layer after layer. The instinct is not wrong exactly, but it is dangerously incomplete because thickness and quantity do nothing to solve the problem of water conducting heat away 25 times faster than air. A man can be wrapped in the thickest, warmest blanket money can buy, and if what is against his own skin underneath that blanket is wet, that blanket is fighting a losing battle all night long, slowing the bleeding, but never stopping it. Those three loggers had good wool blankets over them. What none of us can know for certain, but what the old accounts and the old-timers' own understanding of this danger strongly suggest, is that what those men had on underneath those blankets, against their own skin, was very likely damp from a hard day's work in the cold, and that dampness, hour after hour through the deep of the night, quietly did what the storm never showed up to do. Here is your first thing to carry out of tonight, and I will give you one at the end of every piece. The question in real cold is never simply how many layers you have or how thick your blanket is. The question is what is against your own skin right now and whether it is dry. A thin, dry layer will keep you alive through a night that a thick, wet layer buried under every blanket you own will not. Now, why would a man's clothing ever be wet on a cold winter night when it is not raining and he's nowhere near open water? This brings me to the second piece, and it is the piece that turns a hard day's honest work into a trap nobody sees closing, because the moisture that kills a man in the cold very rarely comes from the sky. It comes from inside him. The second piece is sweat. And this is the cruelest trick this whole danger plays because it strikes hardest against the very men who are working the hardest to stay warm and safe. Picture those 5 loggers swinging axes and hauling timber through a bitter cold day, hard physical labor in heavy winter clothing, and here is the plain physical fact almost nobody thinks through in the moment. Hard physical work generates a tremendous amount of body heat, and the body, doing exactly what it is built to do, sweats to keep from overheating, even in weather that would otherwise feel bitterly cold to a man standing still. A logger swinging an axe for hours in freezing temperatures can soak the clothing against his skin through with sweat just as thoroughly as a man caught out in a rainstorm. And because the cold air keeps the outside of his coat feeling perfectly appropriate, perfectly seasonal, he very often has no clear sense that underneath it all, against his own skin, he has been quietly soaking himself for hours. This is the trap laid entirely by a man's own honest effort, and it very rarely announces itself while the work is still going on, because a working body generates enough heat to mask the danger entirely. A man can labor hard all day, sweat straight through his cotton undershirt, and feel warm and fine the entire time because his own furnace is running hot enough to cover for the wet insulation underneath. The danger only reveals itself once the work stops, once the man sits down by the fire for the night, once his body's heat production drops back down to a resting level, and that damp cotton, no longer masked by a working furnace, begins doing what wet cotton always does, pulling heat straight out of a now quieter body at that same relentless 25 times rate, hour after hour, through the coldest and stillest part of the night, which is almost always the deep hours well past midnight and before dawn. The federal weather and safety records on this exact pattern, going back through generations of outdoor work and military experience alike, bear this out plainly, and it is precisely why so many cold weather deaths and near deaths happen not on the coldest, most obviously dangerous nights, but on nights that felt merely ordinary, nights where a man's guard was down precisely because the danger did not look severe enough to worry about. A raging blizzard puts every man on high alert, watching his gear, checking his shelter, minding every detail. An ordinary hard cold night, after a long day of honest sweating labor, puts a man at ease, confident in his blanket and his fire, with no storm to make him second-guess the damp shirt he has been wearing since sunup. That confidence, more than any storm, is what killed those 3 loggers. So here is your second thing to carry. The most dangerous nights in real cold are very often not the most dramatic ones. They are the ordinary hard nights that follow a day of honest sweat, because that is exactly when a man's guard comes down, and his clothing, unbeknownst to him, is already working against him. If you have worked hard, sweated through your clothes, and now the sun is going down and the temperature is dropping, treat that moment as seriously as you would treat a genuine storm warning, because in terms of what it can do to your body overnight, it very nearly is one. Now, even as this trap closes, a man's own body will try to warn him the same way it always does, if only he knows what those warnings mean. And this is the third piece, and it is the piece I most want you to carry home tonight, because it gave those 3 loggers real warning hours before the end, and by every account we have of how this danger has always played out. Not one of them read it right, because the warnings of this particular killer are strange, and they are easy to mistake for exactly the opposite of what they actually mean. Carbon in the blood is not the mechanism here the way it was in a different danger I have walked you through before. This is a simpler and in its own way, an even crueler process called hypothermia, the steady drop of the body's core temperature below what it needs to keep every system running properly, and it moves through a man in stages, each one stranger than the last, and each one in its own way, actively working against the very warning system that ought to be saving him. The first sign is shivering, and this one at least most folks understand plainly enough. The body, sensing its core temperature beginning to drop, starts shivering violently, an involuntary muscular reaction meant to generate heat through motion, and a man in this stage is cold, uncomfortable, and fully aware something is wrong. This is the first bell, and it is the one bell almost everybody actually hears and understands because it is loud, physical, and impossible to ignore. But here is the strange and dangerous turn this danger takes next, the turn that has fooled far more people than the shivering itself. As the body's core temperature continues to drop past a certain point, the shivering counterintuitively often stops. The muscles simply run out of the reserves needed to keep shaking, and a man who was violently shivering minutes before can suddenly go still and quiet. And here is the trap, because that stillness is very often mistaken by the man himself and by anyone with him as a sign that he is warming up, settling down, getting comfortable at last. It is very nearly the opposite. The stopping of the shivering is frequently a sign that the body has moved into a more serious and more dangerous stage, and it is the second bell, disguised cruelly as relief rather than alarm. The third sign, layered on top of the first two, is a creeping clumsiness and confusion, what old outdoorsmen have long called, in plain rough language, the fumbles and the mumbles and the grumbles, a man losing his fine motor control first, fumbling with buttons or laces or the simplest tasks his hands have done 1,000 times without thought, followed by a thickness and slowness in his speech, a mumbling difficulty getting words out clean, and often an irritability or a strange flat grumbling irritation at people trying to help him, precisely the people he most needs right now. And underneath all three of these signs runs the final and most dangerous cruelty of this whole process, a growing and entirely false sense of warmth and comfort that can settle over a man even as his core temperature continues sinking toward real danger, sometimes severe enough that men in the advanced stages of this condition have been documented removing their own coats and blankets, feeling in their confused and failing state as though they were too warm rather than dangerously cold, a phenomenon so well documented across so many decades of cold weather deaths that it has its own name among those who study it, and it stands as the single clearest, most heartbreaking proof of just how thoroughly this danger turns a man's own senses against him at the exact moment he needs them most. Here is the rule, and it is 3 lines, same as always. 1. Violent shivering in the cold is the first bell, and it means stop what you are doing, get dry, and get warm immediately, not eventually. 2. Shivering that suddenly stops, especially if it stops without you actually feeling warmer through any real change in your situation, a change of clothes, a bigger fire, actual added warmth, is not a good sign. It is the second bell, disguised as relief, and it means the danger has deepened, not eased. 3. Clumsy hands, slurred or slow speech, confusion, or a strange, irritable resistance to help, especially paired with a false sense of warmth or comfort that does not match the actual conditions around you, is the third bell, and by the third bell, the man experiencing it may no longer have the clarity of mind to save himself, which is exactly why anyone traveling or camping with others has to know these signs well enough to act on someone else's behalf, because the person in the deepest danger is very often the person most convinced in that moment that he is perfectly fine. Gideon told me the story of his cousin, plain and flat, the way he told most hard things. His cousin had been out running a trap line alone in weather no worse than plenty of other days that winter, came in later than expected, and when they found him, he had shed his outer coat along the trail, folded it almost neatly, as though he had simply decided he no longer needed it, and Gideon never let himself forget the strangeness and the horror of that detail. A man taking off his own coat in weather that killed him within the hour. He drilled into me, from the time I was old enough to walk a trap line myself, that the moment shivering stopped feeling like discomfort and started feeling like relief, that was not a moment to relax. It was a moment to act like your life depended on it, because by every account anybody in this family has ever passed down, it very well might. I have felt that false comfort myself exactly once, coming in off a hard, cold morning years ago, soaked through with sweat under my coat, sitting down by a fire and feeling a strange, pleasant, heavy calm settle over me that some quiet part of my mind, trained by Gideon's voice more than my own good sense in that moment, recognized as wrong. I got up. I changed into dry clothes I had, thank God, thought to carry. I do not know for certain what would have happened if I had simply enjoyed that calm the way my body was telling me to, and I have never once been curious enough to find out. So there is your third thing to carry. Learn the three bells: violent shivering, the false relief of shivering stopping, and the clumsy, confused, false warmth that follows, and understand that every one of those bells, especially the second and third, is trying to trick you into believing the exact opposite of what is actually happening. Now, here is where I have to break the pattern of this story for a moment, friend, because everything I have told you so far, the true danger of water over cold, the trap of honest sweat, the three strange and misleading bells, is knowledge that most experienced old timers carried some rough working version of, even without the exact words for it. What comes next is where good, tough, capable people still get caught, even today. And it is very likely the exact wrong turn that took those three loggers from merely damp and cold to dead in their own bedrolls. The fourth piece is the false fix, and I am putting it here on purpose, the same as every time before, because it is the single most natural, most understandable wrong turn a cold, tired man can take, and it wears the mask of good sense the whole way down. Here is the false fix, laid out plain. A man feels the cold creeping in, maybe even feels that first honest shiver, and his mind quite reasonably reaches for more insulation. He pulls his blanket tighter. He adds a second blanket if he has one. He huddles closer to the fire. Every single one of those actions sounds correct. And in a situation where the man's clothing against his skin is dry, every one of those actions would be exactly the right move. But if what is against his skin is wet, piling more insulation on top of that wetness does not solve the underlying problem. It merely traps the damp, cold layer closer against his body, sometimes actually slowing the evaporation that might otherwise eventually have dried that layer out on its own. And all the while, that wet fabric keeps doing its relentless work, pulling heat straight through every blanket a man piles on top of it, at that same brutal 25 times rate, hour after hour after hour. This is the same wheel I have described before in different clothing, because these traps tend to wear a similar shape no matter what danger is driving them. The body signals distress, cold, and discomfort, and the natural, sensible response, more insulation, more blanket, closer to the fire, does nothing to address the actual cause, which was never a lack of blanket in the first place. It was the wet layer underneath every blanket a man owns, quietly stealing his warmth all night long, regardless of how much dry material got piled on top of it. A man doing this feels for a while like he is fighting back, like he is taking sensible action against the cold, and the whole time, the true problem sits unaddressed and unaddressed and unaddressed right up until his body moves past the point where piling on more blankets could have helped him at all, even if he had suddenly understood the real problem in that moment. Picture it plain, because I want this to sit with you properly. A logger climbs into his bedroll at the end of a hard sweating day, his undershirt damp against his skin, and he feels a chill work its way in as the fire burns low through the night. He does not strip off the damp shirt, because that seems backward, taking off clothing in the cold, and besides, it is dark and it is bitter, and getting up to change is the very last thing a tired man wants to do. He pulls his wool blanket tighter instead, and for a little while that helps, or feels like it helps, and he settles back down, and the damp shirt keeps right on doing its work underneath, and somewhere in the deep hours of that ordinary cold night, his body crossed from uncomfortable into genuine danger without a single dramatic moment marking the change. That is the false fix closing the trap all the way shut, and it is very likely, though no man can say for certain after the fact, close to the exact shape of what happened to three men who had every reasonable tool available to survive that night and simply reached for the wrong one first. Here is your fourth thing to carry, and it runs against instinct just as hard as the pieces before it. When you are cold in your bedding and the cause is wet clothing against your skin, more blankets on top is not the answer, and neither is huddling closer to a dying fire without addressing what you are actually wearing. The answer, uncomfortable as it sounds in the moment, is to get that wet layer off your skin and get something dry against it instead, even if that means a cold, unpleasant minute of exposure while you make the change, because that one cold minute is a vastly better trade than the slow, silent hours of heat loss that follow if you do not make it. Now, if piling on blankets over a wet layer is the wrong turn, what did the old-timers actually do night after night through 100 winters of hard outdoor work to keep this exact trap from closing on them? That is the fifth piece, and it is the piece of real practical craft this whole story has been building toward. The fifth piece is the deliberate, disciplined habit of managing what sits against your own skin, treated with the same seriousness the old-timers gave to managing fire and shelter, and it comes down to a small handful of practices that cost very little and demand only that a tired man do one uncomfortable thing before he lets himself rest. Start with the material itself, because this is the single biggest lever a man has, and it is the one most completely lost to the modern day. The old-timers, whenever they had the means to choose, favored wool against the skin for exactly the reason I laid out in the first piece, because wool retains a meaningful share of its insulating value even when damp, and it wicks moisture outward and releases it gradually rather than holding it pooled cold against the body the way cotton does. A wool undershirt, wool socks, wool long underwear, these were not luxuries or preferences to the old-timers. They were, in cold, wet work conditions, closer to survival equipment, chosen with exactly the same seriousness a man gave to choosing a good rifle or a sound axe head. Cotton had its place, plenty of it, for warm weather work and everyday comfort, but a careful old-timer heading into hard cold weather labor, and especially anyone planning to sleep out in genuine cold, reached for wool against his skin first every single time, because he understood, whether or not he could explain the science of it, that wool forgave a wet mistake in a way cotton simply did not. Second, and this is a habit rather than a piece of gear, the old-timers practiced what amounted to a nightly ritual of changing out of the day's damp working layer before they ever climbed into their blankets for the night. This sounds simple, almost too simple to matter, and that is exactly why so many people then and now skip it on a cold, tired night, when changing clothes feels like the last thing in the world worth the effort. But a careful trapper, hunter, or logger carried a second dry set of the layer closest to his skin, specifically for this purpose, not extra outer clothing, but a dry undershirt, dry socks, whatever had been doing the sweating work all day, and the ritual of stripping off the wet layer and putting on the dry one before sleep, uncomfortable and cold for a minute or two in the doing, was treated as a non-negotiable part of making camp, every bit as essential as building the fire itself. Third, and this ties directly back to something we have touched on before, the old-timers used the fire itself in the hours before sleep, not merely for warmth, but as a drying station, hanging the day's damp clothing close enough to the flame to drive the moisture out of it steadily through the evening, rotating pieces near and away from the heat to avoid scorching, so that by the time the fire banked down for the night, a man had, in addition to his dry sleeping layer, a set of outer clothing waiting dry and ready for the cold work of the following morning. This turned the evening fire into double duty, warming the camp and rescuing the next day's clothing from the same wet trap that had threatened the night's sleep. Fourth, and this is the piece that ties the whole practice together into a single working habit, the old-timers treated a hard sweating day as an automatic trigger for extra caution at night, rather than waiting to feel cold before taking any action at all. The moment the day's labor ended and the body's furnace began cooling down toward its resting rate, a careful man assumed, as a matter of course, that whatever he had been wearing against his skin all day was compromised, and he acted on that assumption immediately, rather than waiting to feel the chill creep in before doing anything about it. Waiting for the cold to announce itself, as those three loggers most likely did, was waiting far too long, because by the time a man feels seriously cold in his bedding, the wet layer against his skin has often already been doing its damage for an hour or more. Let me put one more piece of this craft in your hands plain, because it rounds out the whole picture, and it has to do with what a man sleeps on, not merely what he sleeps in. The old-timers understood in their own rough, practical way that the ground beneath a sleeping man pulls heat out of his body through direct contact every bit as relentlessly as wet clothing does, sometimes worse, because bare earth or snow will draw warmth away from a resting body all night long, regardless of how good the blanket on top happens to be. A careful trapper or logger, whenever the situation allowed it, never simply lay a bedroll straight onto frozen ground. He built a bed of pine boughs, dry leaves, cut brush, anything that could put a layer of trapped insulating air between his body and the cold earth beneath him, understanding, without needing the words for it, that warmth lost downward through direct contact with the ground was every bit as real a danger as warmth lost outward through wet clothing. A man who did the careful work of drying his base layer and choosing wool against his skin, and then lay that same careful preparation straight down onto bare frozen ground, was still bleeding heat out through his back the entire night, undoing a good portion of the very care he had just taken everywhere else. This is why so many of the old shelters, the half-faced camps, the trapping cabins, the simple lean-tos thrown up for a single hard night included some kind of raised or insulated sleeping platform whenever time and materials allowed for it, a few inches of boughs or brush, or even a simple platform of split logs, enough to break that direct, relentless contact with the cold ground below. It cost a man perhaps 20 extra minutes of work at the end of an already long day, gathering and laying that insulating bed, and it is exactly the kind of small, unglamorous labor that gets skipped by a tired man in a hurry to lie down, the same way changing out of a damp shirt gets skipped, and for exactly the same reason, and with exactly the same quiet risk attached to skipping it. So here is your fifth thing to carry, and it is 5 practices braided into one now, the same shape as always. Favor wool, or any fabric that holds its insulating value wet, against your own skin whenever real cold and real exertion are both in the picture. Change out of the day's damp base layer into a dry one before you ever climb into your blankets, treating it as a non-negotiable part of making camp rather than an optional comfort. Use your evening fire deliberately to dry out the next day's clothing, not merely to warm the air around you. Never lie down directly on bare cold ground when any material at all is available to build even a thin insulating layer beneath you, and treat a hard sweating day as an automatic signal to take all of these precautions immediately, rather than waiting until the cold itself forces the issue, because by then the trap may already be closing. That is the craft. That is what kept 100 generations of hardworking men alive through cold nights that, on paper, should have been perfectly survivable and very often were, for every man who understood this one small, unglamorous rule. Now here is another pattern break, friend, because we are at the edge of the last piece, and I want you square with me before we step over it. Everything so far, the true danger of wet insulation, the trap of honest sweat, the 3 misleading bells, the false fix of piling on more blanket, the old-timer's practical craft, most careful old-timers carried some working version of, even without the science to fully explain it. What comes next is the why underneath it all, and it is also the reason this old danger became, if anything, more common as this country grew wealthier and its closets grew fuller. And once I tell you why, you are going to look at your own dresser drawers a little differently before this video is through. The 6th piece, the last piece, is the plain material history of why cotton, of all things, came to dominate the closets and the work clothes of ordinary Americans, displacing the wool that had protected generations before it. And once you understand that history, the pattern of exactly this kind of death, quiet, ordinary, blamed on the cold rather than the closet, makes a great deal more sense. For most of this country's early history, wool was the standard fabric for serious outdoor and working clothing, and it earned that place honestly through the plain, hard-won knowledge of exactly the properties I have described to you tonight. But wool was expensive relative to cotton, because turning raw wool into finished cloth by hand, carding it, spinning it, weaving it, was slow, skilled, labor-intensive work, and a family's supply of good wool clothing was something built up carefully over years, mended and passed down rather than easily replaced. Cotton, by contrast, became dramatically cheaper to produce starting in the early 1800s, following the widespread adoption of the cotton gin, a machine that made separating cotton fiber from its seeds vastly faster than doing it by hand, which in turn drove an explosion of cotton cultivation across the American South and an equally rapid explosion of cotton textile mills across New England, mills that could turn out finished cotton cloth at a volume and a price wool simply could not match. By the middle of the 1800s and accelerating hard through the decades after, cheap, mass-produced cotton clothing became the practical, affordable default for ordinary working Americans, including the loggers, trappers, farmers, and frontier families who had, a generation or two earlier, relied far more heavily on wool. This was not, in most cases, a foolish choice on anybody's part. Cotton was cheaper, it was comfortable in warm weather, it was easier to clean, and for the overwhelming majority of days in a working man's year, it served him perfectly well. The trouble is that the exact conditions where cotton's weakness turns deadly, hard cold combined with hard sweating labor followed by a long still night, are not everyday conditions, and a man who wore cotton against his skin for years without incident, because most days simply never tested that particular weakness, had no obvious reason to think twice about it on the one night that did. This shift only deepened as the country moved into the 20th century. Industrial-scale cotton production kept prices low and availability high. Military surplus clothing after 2 world wars put enormous quantities of cheap cotton garments into ordinary American households, and the post-war boom in cheap, mass-produced clothing of every kind further cemented cotton as the default fabric touching most American skin, in work clothes, in undergarments, in nearly everything, while wool increasingly became associated with expense, itchiness, and old-fashioned inconvenience rather than the serious, life-protecting material it had always actually been. Nobody set out to make this switch dangerous. It happened the same reasonable, gradual way most of these old dangers get buried, through cost, convenience, and comfort, real advantages that mattered enormously in ordinary daily life and simply never got weighed against the one narrow, dangerous set of conditions where the old wool favoring wisdom actually mattered most. It is worth saying plainly because it took the modern outdoor and mountaineering community working through exactly this pattern of otherwise unexplained cold weather deaths across the 20th century to finally put a sharp, memorable name to the old danger the frontier generations had known mostly through hard experience and family stories rather than formal science. That phrase, blunt and often repeated in outdoor safety circles to this day, boils the whole lesson down to 2 words, and I will let you hear it plain rather than dance around it, because it deserves to be said exactly as the people who rediscovered this danger the hard way chose to say it themselves. Cotton kills. Not always, not on every ordinary day, but under exactly the conditions I have walked you through tonight. Hard work, real cold, a long still night, that plain, cheap, comfortable fabric that fills nearly every closet in this country has quietly taken lives that a simple wool undershirt chosen instead would very likely have saved. So that is the 6th piece, the buried heart of the whole thing. This danger did not fade as this country grew more prosperous and better equipped. In important ways, it grew more common because prosperity and industrial efficiency filled American closets with exactly the wrong fabric for the one narrow, dangerous situation where the difference between wool and cotton stops being a matter of comfort and starts being a matter of life and death. Not a conspiracy, friend, and I want to be as careful and honest with you about that as Gideon was always careful and honest with me. Nobody built cotton mills intending to freeze anybody. It was cost, convenience, and comfort, 3 perfectly reasonable things that together buried a piece of old, hard-won knowledge under a century and a half of cheap, comfortable clothing that serves a man perfectly well right up until the one cold, sweating night it does not. Let me hand you the whole of it back together now, the way it ought to sit in your mind after tonight. Real cold by itself rarely kills a properly insulated man because the human body is a strong and steady furnace on its own. What kills is wet insulation against the skin because water pulls heat away roughly 25 times faster than air, and cotton, once wet, loses the overwhelming majority of its insulating value and holds that wetness stubbornly against the body for hours. That wetness very often comes not from rain or snow, but from a man's own honest sweat during hard cold weather labor, sweat that his own working body masks entirely until the work stops and the cold, still night reveals the trap that was already set. Your own body will ring 3 bells if you know to listen: violent shivering, then a false relief as that shivering stops, then clumsy confusion paired with a dangerous, misleading sense of warmth, and every one of those bells, especially the last two, tries to convince you of the exact opposite of what is actually happening inside you. The natural instinct to answer cold with more blankets piled on top of a wet layer is the false fix, the same wheel that only ever turns downward. The old craft that beat this danger for generations was plain and disciplined. Favor wool or any fabric that holds warmth wet, change into a dry layer before sleep without exception. Use the evening fire to dry tomorrow's clothes, and treat a hard sweating day as an automatic warning rather than waiting for the cold to prove the danger real. And underneath all of it sits the reason this danger never actually left us, which is that the plain economics of cotton and wool, playing out over a century and a half, filled this country's closets with the wrong fabric for the one situation where the difference actually matters most. This was never really a story about a blizzard, friend, because there was no blizzard, only an ordinary cold night and an extraordinarily common mistake. It was about the difference between a man who understands what sits against his own skin and a man who has simply never had reason to think about it. And that difference is exactly what separated 2 loggers who woke up from 3 who did not, on a night no colder than a dozen others. They had all slept through just fine. If you find yourself working hard and real cold this winter, chopping wood, hauling gear, hunting from dawn until dusk, you will not simply trust your blanket and your fire the way most folks still do without ever hearing this. You will know to ask what is against your own skin, not merely how many layers sit on top of it. You will know the 3 bells, and you will act on the second and third ones, even though your own confused body may be telling you there's nothing wrong. That is not fear talk, and it is not doom talk. That is the same ordinary, careful competence your great-grandparents carried in their own choice of undershirt. Competence that got quietly priced out of the modern conversation about comfort and clothing, and that you just picked back up again tonight. You do not need to overhaul your whole wardrobe this week, friend. Do one thing. If you own even one good wool or wool blend base layer, a shirt, a set of long underwear, socks, set it aside specifically for hard cold weather work or overnight cold exposure, and get in the habit of reaching for it instead of cotton whenever real cold and real exertion are both likely to be part of your day. And if you do not own one yet, that is your one thing to find before the season gets much colder, because it costs a great deal less than a hospital bill and does a job no thickness of cotton blanket can fully replace. Your grandfather likely knew this one way or another, whether he had the science behind it or only the hard, plain habit of a wool shirt kept for the coldest days and a fire used for drying as much as for warming. Somebody just did not get the chance to hand it down to you the way Gideon handed it down to me. Tell me down below, neighbor. Did your own family ever talk about this? A relative lost or nearly lost to an ordinary cold night rather than a dramatic storm? An old-timer who swore by wool and would not hear a word against it? A habit of changing clothes before bed that got passed down without anybody quite explaining why? Different families carried this warning in different words, if they carried it at all, and the story that gets the most of you talking down there is the one I go deepest on next. And before you go, one more thing, because it follows naturally from everything we have covered tonight. Next time, we are going after the trail food that carried mountain men and trappers 1,000 miles on almost nothing, a dense, humble cake of dried meat and rendered fat that the old fur companies issued by the pound because they had learned the hard way exactly what a man needs to keep working through a hard winter, and how a family today could make a version of it in their own kitchen for pennies on the dollar compared to what the outdoor stores charge for a pale modern imitation. If you want that one, and I expect you will, tap subscribe, because we are pulling these old, buried pieces of knowing back into the light one at a time, and there are more of you finding your way here every week. And that matters a great deal more than you might think. Done by hand, told straight.